Hello, everyone, and welcome to welcome to our special edition of EnergySource Innovation Stream. Happy International Women's Day. Today, we will discuss the progress made to date, as well as remaining challenges faced by women entering the clean energy and clean tech industries. While I share several reminders, we have a quick poll question for you, and we'd like to get a sense of how you would rate gender parity at your organization, with 1 being poor and 5 being excellent. Several reminders. First, you can follow us on Twitter at AC Global Energy and use the hashtag InnovationStream. Second, following this panel discussion, you can submit questions through the Q&A function in Zoom, and I will try to get to as many of these as I can. If you're watching on another platform like YouTube, unfortunately, we will not be able to take your question. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome our esteemed panelists today, Caroline Cochran, who is the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Oklo, Dr. Jennifer Holgram, who is the Chief Executive Officer at LanzaTech, and Dana Clay Redden, who is the founder of Solar Stewards, and of course, Dr. Emily Reichert, who is the Chief Executive Officer at Greentown Labs. Thank you all so much for joining us today for this interactive and important discussion. Let's start off with something positive, with a positive question. Well, there's still a lot more work that needs to be done to bridge the gender gap across the clean energy innovation ecosystem. We've seen some improvements in some areas: corporate commitments to gender parity, effective programs, policies. Could you talk about the progress you've seen in your organizations? Are there any specific success stories that you'd like to share? And what initiatives and programs have proven successful in your experience?
I can jump in. So one of more interesting things that's happened over this year is that we are now at gender parity in our major science teams. And I think that's a really big deal. But more importantly, during the whole Black Lives Matter movement, a group of members of the company, employees, got together and started a group that they now call Blend. And their entire purpose was to really evaluate and help the company in terms of inclusion, diversity, and equity. And I was very excited to see this, but seeing the results and the amount of work that they've put in, they even did a questionnaire that was really eye-opening for us on how people felt in the company. Nobody ever asks you, are you feeling uncomfortable or anything like that? And it's really kind of neat how they brought the company together during Black History Month. For example, they had newsletters throughout the month. They ended the month with a Black History Jeopardy. Today, for International Women's Day, they issued a newsletter for everybody to read about these great women. So I'm really excited to see company initiatives that are driving change, because some of these things don't happen top down. They instead happen because they bubble up and people get together and become conscious of the need to act. So I think that's a good example.
And I can jump on to that example. So first and foremost, happy International Women's Day to everyone on the panel and everyone in the audience. And thank you to the Atlantic Council for convening us. I think this is a very important topic. And the fact that we are talking about it at all and talking about how to improve diversity, gender diversity in the clean tech industry both speaks to the progress and how much work is yet to be done. Because I do feel like we continue to ask these questions, but maybe now with increasing focus and intensity in trying to make forward progress, we'll see some different results. I too have had the experience of our staff really doing a grassroots type of really a working group around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And for those who may not know Greentown Labs, we support about 100 startup companies who are working in the climate tech industry. And we felt after the murder of George Floyd, really a need to bring the community together around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so this was led by our community director, involved many of our startup founders, as well as our team and board members. And that group has really come to the point of sharing a few big goals that they would like to achieve, and then really a plan for continuing the work in 2021. Besides that, we've had longer standing groups around women in clean tech, and there's a steering committee at Greentown Labs specifically around that, and as well an initiative that we launched this year called Women Plus in climate tech. So that is really meant to be inclusive of folks that are non-binary in addition to women. And I think that it's important to try to include groups and really think about intersectionality as you create and structure these different kinds of initiatives. Really, there are so many different overlaps, so many different reasons that folks have trouble in the workplace and getting moved forward, getting promoted, really building careers in an environment that they feel safe and comfortable. And so all of these things really are related to one another, and we should treat them as such.
Thank you, Emily. Excellent. Did anyone else want to pitch in on this one, or should we keep going with the questions? All right, so Roger, for this next one, let's pull up the answers for a little bit of context as we dive into the next discussion. So these are some poll results. For the next question, let's talk about where are we seeing some of the greatest challenges? And this is a bit of context of where today's audience is in terms of where they feel gender parity is. So we do have this average of 3 with no one really said poor. So I guess that's great for the audience that's joined in today. But ideally, we would all see 5s, right? Kind of thinking about what are still the greatest barriers, what are still the greatest obstacles, and also kind of looking at some of the answers that our audience shared with us today. What are your thoughts on that? And maybe we can hear from Dana, since we'll start with Dana and go to Caroline to make sure that we capture all of the panelists.
Well, I love the fact that this event included a poll, because I think the real key to progress here is that internal audit and that ability to self-reflect. I think if I were to have a takeaway as far as what individuals can do within their organizations to facilitate more of this change, it would be that personal accountability. Because you can have policies all day, but if the team and the staff is not practicing them, living them, and breathing them, then they get a little lost in the sauce. So it was very encouraging to see what looked like an honest assessment from the participants to say, at least in that 3 mark, we have some ways to go. Also, I think it's amazingly encouraging and uplifting to hear of the lasting impact of the Black Lives Matter movement and how that has affected positive change for everybody. And so when we look at the evolution of equality and equity, now we have those 3 different pillars: diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think when we can look back and see where well-intentioned measures weren't as effective as we had hoped, it was because one of those pillars was missing. So Emily had mentioned the word comfortable when talking about a workforce that's really taking on these challenges and not just doing a good job, but doing an innovative job. And I love the theme of this talk centered on innovation as well. That inclusion piece is just so critical. You've got to make sure that once you have a diverse workforce in the door, that they feel comfortable, safe, and trusted to bring their full selves to that mission.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Dana was saying. I think it's one thing to have equal representation, but to have equitable treatment is, I think, a real key. So when Dana was mentioning that policies don't necessarily help, maybe, we want to have X% of this person or that person, or we want to have X% of our recruits, or however you do it. Sometimes if that percent of people aren't feeling like they're being included or respected in the same way, it won't be long lasting. It'll be a short-lived initiative. And so I think really making sure that the culture is right is really important. And as far as your prior question, like how do you make sure that that happens? Obviously my company is a small startup, but I think what we've seen by having women involved right from the get-go, so I was a co-founder, and I think that just kind of sets the tone moving forward. I can certainly sympathize that for large organizations, it's much more difficult to shift a broad culture. But I think once you have women have that seat at the table, it does end up taking care of itself, but you're making sure that that culture is in place as well.
Excellent. I want to dive in a little bit more on some of the comments that were already made. Talking about how to make sure that, so a lot of these challenges are exacerbated for women of color and LGBTQ plus women. So we've already touched on a little bit in this area, but how do we make sure that all women are included as we talk about these challenges? How do we make sure that gender parity is inclusive?
I have to say, personally, I'm a big believer in just having voices at the table. And when you leave any voices out, you run the risk that the outcome of that, whatever it is, process, development of policies, development of structures, building an organization, is not that perspective not being represented, winds its way through the organization over time. And I think that Caroline had also mentioned something similar. I think that if you start your startup or your young innovative company around bringing together multiple voices, from different perspectives, you will have a stronger company going forward. And I've actually witnessed that with a number of our startups. Often if there's a diverse founding team, that team just goes further faster. And I haven't done a scientific study to understand exactly why that is, but I can say that I would imagine it is because there are more voices at the table. There are more perspectives being shared. It's not a group think. And I think that is really what we risk when we don't have voices at the table from the very beginning.
Thank you, Emily. Anyone else want to jump in on this?
I can certainly add a little bit. I think this speaks to the fact that it's a learning process for everyone, which is so exciting. We all have work to do here. So when I saw that first, or one of the questions that we had spoke of probably prior, maybe it's spoiler alert yet to come. But when we talk about what we can do to facilitate, better success, one of those said engaging more men. Of course, but certainly this is a mission for all of us. So personally, for instance, I am a straight woman. And so I've had my journey with the LGBTQ community and understanding how I can be a better ally. So, I mean, it's an amazing opportunity to be able to self-reflect and think about, what would I want from this institution or organization, and then how can I become that so that this other group feels included in all those tenets of DEI. So my recommendation would be that this is a journey that we're all in together, and certainly to hold yourself accountable, but also understand that it is a learning journey that we're all going on. So no one should feel picked on, pointed out, bullied in this. We all have work to do, and that work is so important. And knowing that we can do it all together, learn from each other, is inspiring.
Being better allies. I like that. I'm going to follow up on something that Emily said in terms of tracking and measuring some of this success. We can't really track progress if we don't have the right data, and most importantly, quality data. And there's still a lot that we don't know about the gender gap and its impact on organizations. So how can we do better at collecting and verifying this data and then adjusting our initiatives and our actions based on that?
Well, I'd maybe address that in a couple different ways. One is I feel like there's a step before collecting the data, which is understanding what it is that you are trying to achieve and laying out a pathway to get there. And then you measure a baseline point, and then you keep measuring. I feel like there's a lot of just go measure things and not a lot of thought about how you are actually going to do that and develop meaningful, sustainable outcomes over time. I know my team and company, we are very actively thinking about this. And what I've said is that anything we do in this space needs to be real. It's not about what you put on your website or your, statistics necessarily, or just what you're putting out there as goals. It's about really building the infrastructure for the long haul, because all of this takes a really long time. And you have to build in sustainable practices, policies, and really just a mental mindset that this is long, hard work, and it's going to have a good outcome. And there's a business reason for doing it in addition to the moral imperative to do it. But, I think the data is one piece, but it is not the end of the story. And so there's a lot of work to be done around that data collection.
And I would add to that the old saying, be careful what you measure because you're going to get it. And so putting some really great thought into what it is you want to measure and what it is you want to create. I would say the second thing that is really important is that you should plan for the long haul. You're not going to change a culture overnight. And I think that is super important. And then to a word that Clara used, ally, I think being an ally is the most important thing that we can all choose to become, because I think you cannot have diversity unless we are all conscious of what is happening around us. If all we're worried about is what's happening to us or to one specific group or individual, it's not going to create the lasting culture change. And I would say that I know today's International Women's Day and that we're all women, but for me, the biggest gaps I see in inclusion these days are not just women. And so what I've really become conscious of, that when I use the word diversity and inclusion, I absolutely do not mean women only. Women are critically important to that equity, but I want to be very conscious that we need to open it up. If we really want different views, it isn't just men and women. And I would say that is something we need to think about, how to encourage more. And I would finish by only saying that the only way we're going to encourage more into our fields is by going back to pre-kindergarten. And so that's how long this journey is. So we just need to get on with it.
Thank you, Jennifer. Anyone else on measuring and tracking the role of that in making progress on gender parity? All right, we'll move on to the next question. So of course, the elephant in the room is COVID-19. And with COVID-19, some of the progress that we've made, that we've gained, some of that actually disappeared in the last year. Women are spending more time caring for their loved ones. Some are stepping back slightly from their careers. So some altogether are exiting the workforce. Thoughts on how we can expedite the economic recovery to where women and women of color, LGBTQ plus women, all women are kind of included in that conversation. And so how do we gain back some of the progress lost in the last year?
I'll start a little bit. I think one of the things that is important to go back to your prior question, which is not just what data do we collect, but how do we interpret that data? It's fairly well known that during depressions or recessions, women take some of the hardest hits, both in terms of employment, but in other measures as well. And so I think, what we're seeing, there's a spectacular loss of employment and loss of, even businesses and so forth. And so that's obviously concerning. And how do we make women's roles more essential such that they're not losing their jobs every time there's a recession? And I think the other key factor that I think we all realize is women tend still by far take on the most care responsibilities within a household. And that's for parents, for children, and even just household activities. So when things are stretched, odds are they'll take time off of work to take care of those things. And how do we make sure women are supported? And obviously, that's a really big cultural and political question, I think. How can the government kind of look at better support of childcare and those kinds of things, especially for lower income folks? So it's a big and complex question, but I did want to throw out there some of my concerns about how women tend to always take the brunt when things get tougher. And we're strong, but how do we make it so that that's not the case, I think is an interesting question.
Thank you, Caroline.
I just want to acknowledge for all the parents out there that this pandemic has been really, really hard. And no matter whether you're male, female, what parent, if you're supporting an elderly relative during this time, it is so hard. And we don't really have the supports, nor are the supports being prioritized, like childcare that Caroline just mentioned, getting kids back to school in a way that is safe and everyone feels comfortable with. Those things kind of seem like afterthoughts. And to me, that's the power, or could be the power, of women's voices more clearly able to be part of the decision-making table. Do you think that childcare would have been left behind if there was a woman with young children at the helm of some of these states, for example? I don't think it would have. You don't have those voices at the table, and that's why you get these policies that really, make it even harder for women, women of color, LGBTQ women, all women can really be struggling in this time in a way that they just don't need to do. And I think we as employers, though, also can play an important role in this. It used to be, and many have commented on this, that if you have a kid breaking into your background noise, now we're on Zoom, or your Zoom screen, oh my God, you have children. It might mean that you're not serious about work. And I think we've all just realized that we just got to have those kids, pets, plants, whatever it is going on in the background, parents, and it's okay. And people can still be productive, even with those distractions. And in fact, to me, it creates a little bit of joy often in a workplace that is so hard during this pandemic. So I've really welcomed that on my team. There are screaming children in the background. Those kids are home from school, they're home from daycare. What else are the parents supposed to do? We just got to be accepting and let everyone get through this in a way that makes sense for everyone, all parents.
Thank you, Emily. I must say that our team is pretty lucky in terms of the cute babies and the cute pets that we get to enjoy. So really grateful for that during team meetings. Anyone else want to touch on this?
I'd love to add just a couple thoughts, and I certainly enjoy that perspective and agree. I think that we have actually, and of course, not to downplay the crisis and the impact on lives and the lost lives of from COVID-19. But with any type of crisis, we also have an amazing opportunity. Just as was said, what a shift we've all experienced. And so what I'd like to see is that pendulum swing in the complete other direction where we're supporting and valuing women. And what does that mean? Caroline mentioned it with, greater support systems, whether that's on a government level or through an employer, a private sector employer, but also let's address this wage gap. Let's pay women equally. Let's come out of this crisis knowing that we're going to be better than before. And what that means to me is ensuring that if a woman is doing the exact same job as a man, that she makes the same compensation.
Thank you. Excellent points. I want to jump towards talking about how well we're conveying the value of having women at the table and in key decision-making positions as well. And obviously, it shouldn't just be up to women to ensure this. There's several interesting statistics, of course. In the 2 years following a new CEO appointment, the stock price for companies that appoint female chief executives outperformed those that appointed men by an average of 20%. And this is an S&P study in terms of the source. How do we do a better job of conveying, communicating this, and encouraging others to share this information?
I do think in some ways it's less known, but I guess the optimistic point on that is that it is becoming more well known. For instance, Goldman Sachs allocated $500 million to this thing called Launch with GS that's targeted towards minority, people of color, and women founders, and they are bringing forward those exact kind of facts as the reason for doing that. So I love when it's not just for kind of, I don't want to say fluffy, but just kind of like, oh, feel good reason. It's like, no, actually the numbers also bear it out too, that women are excellent to have on a founding team, in a boardroom, and so forth. And I think there's a lot of stats. I'm glad you brought that one up. And there's other really interesting ones. And so I guess on the optimistic side, I feel like it's getting better known. But I think still, from the kind of startup founder perspective, there's huge gaps when it comes to how investors look at women, I still think, and because they are still largely men. I've seen interesting, I'll call it interesting, I suppose, situations where they literally just didn't fund startups that had to do with women's health because it felt gross to them. Like really, like that's ultimately kind of what it came down to. And then once it got further along, because a couple of people believed in them, they started seeing the numbers and coming around to it. But it's interesting to see how, just personal experiences color things, and that can be for better, for worse. But largely, when we see not enough women as funders, I think it really bears out in how many women even get the capital to do innovative things and to perform on those metrics. And I'll say, actually, I think that culture can extend to women themselves. So women can buy into that culture that says that women aren't good at things, or are challenging to work with, or will take time off for kids. I'll say the one woman investor that I met with, the very first question she asked me was if I was planning to have kids. So it can come from women too, and I think this culture broadly needs to be just broken up.
Wow. Sorry, I was taken aback by somebody saying they were asked that question. So I didn't realize that still happens. So I'm really shocked and sad. I would say,
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. One of the things we've done a lot of is we have leave now that is for both men and women. So you don't need to ask a man or a woman whether they're going to have a child, because they will undoubtedly. And so they'll both get their appropriate time off, and they'll learn to, from an early day, they'll be part of the life of their child. I wanted to just say something about raising cash, because this is something I've seen throughout my entire life. It's not just on the venture side, but in everything I've ever had to deal with. Our culture systemically supports approaches that select women out. Okay. In the venture world, data would tell you there aren't enough women on the VC side, and therefore they're not investing enough in women leaders or founders. But part of the problem is also just the questions. If you look at the questions that a woman gets asked versus a man gets asked, there's been studies that show that when the men are asked questions when they're raising cash, people want to talk about promotion questions, gains. For women, they ask them downside scenarios. So it's kind of a spiral, right? If you don't get asked the right question, if you don't get put in the right situation, you cannot dig out of that. And I think we need to learn to ask questions and to support behavior that isn't gender biased. And I think that to me is the biggest challenge in the VC world. I can tell you from my personality, I don't get up there and brandish what I can do. But if you watch me, I get it done. and I don't set targets that are ridiculously aggressive. I don't make up numbers on cost per gallon, and you would say, well, you're not going to be as successful as they are. Okay, then we cannot be asked these questions. We cannot continue to be asked these questions. We are being set up to fail.
Wow. Thank you, Jennifer. Alongside this statement, in 2019, 2.8% of venture capital funding went to women-led startups. In 2020, that fell to 2.3%. So, Emily and Dana, because you haven't had a chance to share your thoughts on this particular message, how do we reverse this trend?
I'll take a stab. I think Dr. Jennifer's comments were along the lines of where we need to focus in, identifying those booby traps and pitfalls. And certainly there are many. I think also what Caroline had mentioned as far as more opportunities for women to make those actual decisions. And then, of course, I appreciate this perspective, and it brings it back to that personal accountability. Certainly right. I also have had similar unfortunate scenarios where it seemed that those outdated biased gender roles had also ingrained themselves in the minds of wonderful women leaders. So perhaps it could be as easy and as complicated as thinking internally about how you may be perpetuating the patriarchy, but certainly calling those biases out, those booby traps, and being able to at least identify them would be a great place to start.
At Greentown Labs, I know one thing that we are trying to do this year is to identify investors who prioritize women and other diverse founders, and connect with them, raise their voices, make there be a network of folks that is counter to the old boys network. And that is the work of years, but there are definitely, I don't think it's a pipeline problem. There are women out there that want to build companies. It's a question of the encouragement, the role models, and the opportunities they may or may not have along the way. And I think that any infrastructure we can build that helps women to get there and also raises voices. I just cannot emphasize enough how, when you think about who are the entrepreneurs, when the average American hears entrepreneur, what is your mental mindset of that? It's Mark Zuckerberg probably, or it's Steve Jobs, or it's this white male guy that has accomplished amazing things all on his own. That's the role model of entrepreneurship in this country. And so if you are, and probably around the world really, if you are not in that mold, you are not getting the same, immediately there's some discount in how your presentation is being considered. So one thing I've been thinking about is how could you have investors, just like you change your process around hiring to ask the same questions that you agree upon ahead of time that are important to the success of the candidate at your company, why aren't investors doing this? I know that there is at least one certification for investors who are being committed to investing in diverse founders, but it seems to me that that might be something that's pretty simple. It's like taking the names off, like you do when you review resumes. It seems like there could be some relatively simple things that you could do to at least take away some of that bias. Because it really is, it's who you know and what you look like and whether the investor looks like you. And most of the time, if you're a woman, if you're a person of color, if you're in any underrepresented group, the investor does not look like you. You're not part of that person's network. And we got to lift models of people that have been successful. And we've also got to really think about what can investors do to be more fair and less biased.
And some of those issues also translate into some of the innovation pipeline and patent approval as well, and women feeling empowered and welcome in some of these fields. I'll share this additional statistic. In the patent classes closely related to the energy sector, women were listed in less than 11% of applications and just over 15% for climate change mitigation technology. So slightly better, but 15%. And this is an IEA data set. What is the root cause of these staggering statistics? Emily, you addressed some of it in terms of this bias that exists, that these assumptions that are still there. And you shared some tools of taking off the name to making the initial process as unbiased as possible. But what are some other tangible tools that organizations can implement to make sure that women are included in this really important part of the solution in bringing in these new patents and feeling welcome to do that?
Wow, that's exciting. I want to jump in very short, make a short remark. Having conservatively bumped into this world, it took me some time to really build the right team. And so now I employ a kind of model where if those missions are not aligned, meaning that equity mission, but even just that respect and professionalism from the gate with anyone that I work with, it's a non-negotiable. It's just, we don't have to have another conversation. They're not going to come around in a couple weeks. We'll just go, we'll find someone who really gets it. And so that has certainly helped us because, I think it comes back to that respect, that inclusion, that valuing women, to go into a situation where you have a new, novel, innovative idea and the individual sitting on the other side of the table has to embrace and learn and understand where you're coming from instead of assuming that they already know and going on some, I think the word is mansplaining now, journey. And so I suppose it would be the recruitment of more of those types of professionals and teams that, again, understand the value of women. And that speaks to any type of exercise and innovation, but particularly when you have to describe your innovation to a professional. I'm specifically talking about patent attorneys. But I see if there was an opportunity for more of those stakeholders and professionals, that women would be better represented.
Can I add a comment, Olga?
Please.
I think what Dana just said is super important. It is who we surround the people we are trying to push forward with. This whole mansplaining exercise, right? A woman speaks out with an idea, somebody else repeats it in a man's voice, and that's what everybody's looking at. Hey, great idea. And I think it behooves us to treat these discussions almost like a safety exercise, right? We're all in it together, and we all have to support each other. And if we hear somebody explaining somebody else's idea because it came from a different voice, then we need to stop the meeting, right? We as leaders have a responsibility to stop the meeting and say, I want to listen to what she had to say. Can we let her finish? And I think it's the whole ally exercise and ally discussion. We are responsible for our culture, not the person, not the woman that is trying to get into a leadership role. All of us are, and we need to stop the discussions and we need to support them every chance we get.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'd like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions in the Q&A function on the bottom of the screen. We're about 20 minutes out, so let's jump into the Q&A with the audience, and we already have several questions coming in from Jenna Lococo is asking, how do we enable more male allies for gender parity missions? And how were you able to convince men that this is an important issue that we should be involved in? And it's really great and fantastic and encouraging to see that we have men attending and listening in on this conversation. So because this shouldn't be just a women's job to resolve some of these issues. So thoughts on that?
Two things. One is certainly education and exposure. I mean, it's true for white people with people of color and other underrepresented minorities. If you don't have the exposure, you don't have the training, it's going to be harder for you to understand, to put yourself in that other person's shoes and understand what they're dealing with. And then the second thing is, I think looking on the positive side, there is a very big generational difference between people who have been in the workforce 20 years or so and people who have been in the workforce 10 years or 5 years. And I'd say that this current generation is much more knowledgeable, aware, willing to be a partner in childcare. And maybe it still doesn't end up equal, but at least acknowledging that they should be playing that role is forward progress from where we were 20 years ago. When I started my career, I think it's interesting today, it's all about authenticity and sharing and being inclusive and having, being yourself, telling everything. And I really know that back 20 years ago, you used to actually be advised not to say anything about children, to not point out that you are, leaving for a doctor's appointment in the middle of the day. You had to hide those things. And now I think what's interesting is I see men kind of saying, well, I got to take my kid to a soccer game and blah, 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 or I got to do this, about with their kid. And so I think it's very generational. And so I think we want to encourage this change. And we also want to be aware that for those who are later in their careers right now, they grew up in a very different time period. And so that exposure, that training becomes even more important.
I would jump in too. I think that was a great point, great set of points. But I would add too that I think what we've seen is women that succeed in their career oftentimes can point to a mentor early on. And I think that can be women or men. And I think establishment of mentorship programs could possibly be a really great way to help women learn what, going up the ranks means at that organization, or learn the ropes, or just feel like someone's believing them and knows their story, or knows kind of what they're dealing with and so forth. So I guess I'd add mentorship as to get back to the question as far as securing male allies. I know I had different male mentors in my life that really helped me believe that I could start a company or go to grad school and do well in engineering and so forth. So I think to the degree we can get males to act as mentors, I think that can go a long way, both setting an example for other men, but also helping the women specifically.
Yeah, thank you, Carolyn. I wanted to just quickly add that, this is a very basic part of professional development. I don't feel as if any man should have to be recruited for this. This is, I think, to Emily's point about Gen Z and younger generations coming up, this is 101. This is how to be your best functioning self professional business person. And we see these beautiful stats about the value of business and what they bring to an enterprise. So I suppose, I could say in just a very basic way, be competitive with your skills, bring your full effective self. And that means being an ally in this work. And those that fail to embrace the value that women bring to business and communities, you're missing out. You're not as competitive. You're not making as much money. Your teams are missing that valuable perspective and insight. So I would approach it from that standpoint, from a value add perspective, or at least a basic capability perspective.
Thank you, Dana. Jennifer, did you want to add anything to this?
No, I don't have anything beyond what's been added. I'll leave it there.
Fantastic. One thing that I'll add is, the difference between mentorship and sponsorship. So not everyone, might have the time or could prioritize mentorship with their schedules, but sponsorship is something that anyone can do. And that means that, if you're not in the room, that someone out there is advocating for you, whether it's someone calling around and saying, we're hiring for this position. Do you know anyone? And you sit back and you think, yes, I know these talented, fantastic women who would be excellent for this role. So that type of sponsorship, it doesn't take a lot of time. You could take a few seconds, or someone is putting together a panel and they're saying, I need an expert in this area. And you're saying, well, have you met this person? Let me introduce you. That's a 5-minute email. And that could go a long way. So we do have another question from Tanya Grimes. And this is a tricky one. So how do you request wage info for your peers to determine the wage gap and ask for parity? And that's been an interesting conversation, is the importance of transparency, of knowing who makes what in our organizations, and how do you fairly compare that, and also fight for what's yours. And I think from both perspectives, if you could address it both from an employee and then also an employer, how do you facilitate that kind of transparency?
I'll jump in just with a question. Is that transparency something that in this day and age belongs to the people, again, that we need to promote? And the reason I ask that is because I can't imagine, a human resources group not being the group to be asked to look at this both externally and internally. And that's their responsibility. And I think we need to fix it at that level. A woman should not have to go ask or talk to other people to figure out whether they're being paid enough. That's a good company's, that's something they should do. So then I pose the question to you, Olga, because you work across industries, you impact a lot of industries. How do you get companies to know that they have to be asking these questions? I've heard things today that make me take a step back because they don't happen in my company. And I'm just wondering, what can Atlantic Council do? You know what I mean? How do we change this? And I think it's at your level. That's just a thought.
No, I think that's an interesting point. Thank you, Jennifer. As a think tank, as a thought leader in the space, in the energy space, talking about how does wage transparency impact the talent that you recruit, and how does that impact retention? I think that's a really fascinating and interesting area that's really worth looking into. But I'd love to hear from others who haven't had a chance to speak to this point, if you have something to add on the wage question. It's always such a sensitive area that I think we're like, everyone is still trying to figure out what the right solution is.
Well, I can speak from an employee and an employer perspective. From an employee perspective, I think the thing that you have to think about is your salary going into your career is going to determine where you are the rest of your life. And so doing your homework, and I'm sorry, this is just what you have to do to understand, what does someone in this role make? and then determining based on your background, your education, what you bring to the table, going higher than you think that's actually worth, and you maybe negotiate it down, but you will clearly state your value to that employer, is the right thing to do from the beginning. If you start low, then the rest of your career you will always be low. I think that there is also the opportunity when you are in the middle of your career to sit down with your manager or HR, if that's appropriate, and say, look, I think based on these other 6 positions that I've researched that are very similar to mine, I think I'm underpaid. And, go with the data, bring the data with you. It's hard to refute data. And, that's one area where I think data can be really helpful to you. And from the employer side, there's so many different reasons that people get paid a certain amount. It's the number of years in the company, it's their experience, it's what you were hiring for when you hired that position, and the scope you thought it would have at the very outset, which it may have changed now. And often you are not intentionally underpaying people, but you may not be caught up with leveling everyone. And so I think there's both an onus on the employees and the employer to, find the data, evaluate what it means for various positions in the company, and to do that on a fairly regular basis. I know that my company is definitely overdue for something like that, but we've also been in a very hot job market. So I feel like we are probably pretty close to market, if not above, in the nonprofit positions that we offer.
Emily, should wage history be eliminated in terms of in the hiring process? Should organizations stop asking that?
In Massachusetts, that's illegal.
So that's already happening across them.
It's already happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that's going back to your point of making sure that you're not stuck in that lower gap. Go ahead. Someone started to speak. Do we want to add anything else on this wage discussion? I know that we could talk about this particular topic all day, just because there's so much happening already, so much progress, happening across the nation, but definitely not enough.
I'll say one more thing about being an employer and wages. What's been interesting to me is to watch over the past 5, 6, 7 years that it's actually the women who are asking for more than the men. They are coming in with better data. They are being proactive. They tell me whenever they think they haven't made enough money, and they can back it up. And so it's just interesting. I feel like the men negotiate less, at least with me, and I'm usually the one making that call to say, hey, here's what we're going to offer you, than the women. And I think that's a great change, and it goes to what this population is learning, right out the gate, which is just fantastic. I wouldn't have known to do that, or I wouldn't have known I could even do that. I was glad to have a job, someone paying me really to work. Oh my God, that was so amazing. It's just a totally different mentality to ask for what you're worth. But I'm glad to report that does seem to be happening.
That's fascinating. That's great to hear. Well, I'm afraid we are starting to run out of time, but I do want to provide an opportunity for some closing comments for all of you. If you can kind of finish this off and leave us with some key action items for advancing gender parity in our teams, organizations, and societies. If you can give us 1 or 2 key takeaways that you want everyone to walk away with from this discussion. Dana, let's start with you. You're the first one on my screen, so we'll start there.
My pleasure. Wow, this has been amazing and very inspiring. And I think just to riff off that last valuable contribution, I would say that for all the women out there, you've got to be your own advocate. You can't shy away from having those difficult conversations. How inspiring to hear that women are taking that role on. And so when you do that, recognize that you're bringing value to the table, and that, you have a right to do that. And, various folks over the years have talked to me about this imposter syndrome. And so I would just like to say, if you ever feel those little inklings, just remind yourself of that value that you're bringing. Read some of those good stats. Get a good boss like Emily. Sounds like a great place to work. And thank you so much for this opportunity to really share these valuable insights.
Emily?
Well, thanks for having us. And I think it's been a great discussion. I guess I would leave with a note of hope. And as I've highlighted through this panel, I do think things are changing. And I think this generation, Gen Z in particular, knows what they want and they go out and get it. And I think that's fantastic. I think that men in the workplace, it is also, that role is evolving. I think there's less tolerance for bad behavior than there used to be. And all of those are good things. And so, I'd say, if you can see progress over a 20-year career, it's meaningful, it matters, and it continues to evolve and get better. And I think we just have to keep working on it and promote women's voices that are really at the cutting edge of so many different things, but perhaps are not always raised to the top.
Thank you, Caroline.
Yeah, thanks again for having us on. It was really wonderful to spend time with these amazing women and talk about these topics. I do feel like there's a lot of things changing. Just to provide my perspective from, kind of Silicon Valley entrepreneur kind of perspective, there are groups like Goldman Sachs, like Y Combinator, and others that are really trying to make a difference. But I will say, like, straight talk, and I think we have to have a lot of straight talk with each other as women, that it is still incredibly challenging, and the percentage of dollars is not necessarily going up a lot, and the percentage of women investors is not necessarily going up a lot. But what I would leave as an action item is that, I think we need to keep supporting each other and kind of upvoting each other, echoing each other, and being excited when, there's big female exits. Like, Emily brought up earlier, when we think of an entrepreneur, what do we think of? And honestly, Mark Zuckerberg did pop in my head, and she said probably Mark Zuckerberg. But, I'm excited, not necessarily because we need more billionaires in the world, but I was excited to see the Bumble founder, who's a woman, have such a successful exit. And I think the more that happens, the more things will change, but it's going to be a hard slog. And I think to Dana's point too, work hard, be your own advocate, and these things will come to pass. So yeah, thanks again for having us on.
And last but not least, Jennifer.
Thanks, Olga. First of all, thanks for organizing this and for having us on. For me, it's actually been eye-opening. I've spent too much time buried in Lancet Tech, where we have so much equity and diversity that sometimes I forget that people still have to deal with these things. So thank you for that. I would end with two comments. One is, I actually believe that being a woman is my superpower. That's what makes me different. That's what makes me special. And I hope that in the 30 years of my career working in this tech space, that I hope that I can help other women. And I would ask everybody, because at the end of the day, mentorship, I think, is the most important thing. You said it takes a lot of time, but if we don't have time to mentor other people, then we cannot create the world we want to create. So I leave you with that thought, and I thank you so much for the invitation.
Well, thank you all for tuning in, and thank you to our fantastic speakers today, Caroline, Jennifer, Dana, Emily. I hope we're all walking away feeling a little bit more empowered and inspired. And of course, thank you to all who made this event happen today: John Sogan, Maria Castillo, Roger Morales, and Zainab Varanen. Thank you all for making this event happen today. And of course, our Global Energy Center leadership, Randy Bell and Richard Morningstar, for supporting this important event. Our next innovation stream will be with Kanal Pasamehmotogu, who is the Executive Director for the Versatile Test Reactor, VTR, project at the Idaho National Laboratory. And this episode is scheduled for April 9th. So please make sure to register on the Atlantic Council website once that's posted. I hope that you find a way to celebrate women in your life, not just today, but every day. Happy International Women's Day, and thank you all.